while everyone else will be off playing Detonate Dead, Cold Dot, and Bone Shatter, I'm going to be playing a really off-meta build for the upcoming SSF HC boss race, Poison Seismic Trap. While the progression of this build isn't quite as fast as Detonate Dead in a solo self-found setting, or in a trade setting for that matter, I do think it's quite competitive still, and Exsanguinate Selfcast has a really smooth playstyle when you use that as your primary clear skill. It also has really easy scaling options for softcore trade players if you want to get really high uber damage and do boss carries on like day 1 or day 2, by just substituting 2 Ming's Hearts in and 1 Cold Iron Point. Now hear me out, it's actually slightly different than previous setups. There's 2 main things. Firstly, I've decided to click the Assassin Ascendancy because frankly, every other Ascendancy other than Pathfinder is pretty much, I don't know, useless. And Assassin gives you about twice as much damage as Pathfinder, especially in the early game. Noxious Strike is, I think, the Ascendancy node that really enables early game Poison Seismic, giving you a ton of power because of how difficult it is to poison chance cap in the early game, and also 100% increased poison duration is really strong next patch with the nerfs to the focus ailment duration Betrayed Veiled craft. The thing to note about this node is that increased duration doesn't work with trap skills, so you actually have to use the self-cast skill to apply your poisons. In my case, I thought of 2 possible options. Exsanguinate is the one I'm planning to use on my own run. I linked that with Chain and Unleash and faster casting for a really great clear, while still not having too clunky of a cast speed, and it's more than enough damage because of how strong poison builds are in the early game. The other option you could go for is Blade Vortex, linked with Unleash, probably Ink AoE, and maybe Efficacy. Just for context, I have actually played a BV Seismic Assassin in 3.21, so the most recent patch, and it took me about 30 hours to feel roughly ready to challenge Ubers at the lowest gear level in SF Hardcore, and I got 4 of them down before I died to Uber Cortex. But that had to do more with time constraints and, rolling bad mods, and it's just unlucky, The point is though, this build progresses really quickly, and you do have those 2 primary options for clear, although I do think Blade Vortex isn't really that good of a clear skill, even when you do have Obliteration and Plague Bear. So for this one, I'm playing Exsanguinate main. So this is the tree I'm planning to map with, probably. I might actually go down to Soul Steel, but I'm not super locked in all the choices, but the core tree is pretty much something you've seen over and over and over again. There's one new thing this patch compared to previous patches, which is the addition of Battle Ruse on your main links. Now this is kind of annoying to take, and basically it enables Defiance Banner, but it's at the cost of increasing your mana. So normally this wouldn't really be a bad thing, but because I'm playing Eldritch Battery, I'm using ES to actually cast all my skills. So the increase in mana cost can actually make your Malevolence or your Haste or whatever your Divine Blessing skill start costing a lot. In this particular setup right now it says 510. It just depends on what your gear looks like, how many ES spaces you're losing in the early game. Worst case scenario though, if your ES is too low, you can always path over to Melding, and this will really help you get enough energy shield to be casting your skills. If you're in softcore, I would consider dropping this entire area if you really want to. Hell, you could even stop here because Silent Life Tree isn't even that efficient, and just go for some of the damage nodes. Something like Overcharge is really good for QOL if you don't Betrayal farm at the start to get an Endurance charge on Kill Ring. Wasting is pretty good. Dire Torment ends up being pretty good for Assassin just because of these nodes up here, this Poison over here, and Ambush and Assassinate, able to scale a little bit of poison and crit damage at the same time. And then it's not terrible to get a little bit of trap throwing speed. This is just if you want to get more damage early game. It also enables Revenge of the Hunted, which gives you some base evasion, but just different strokes for different folks. In any case, I think the core tree is fairly solved other than that one new change. The skill gem setup is where this build starts to diverge quite a lot in terms of its mapping setup versus bossing setup, and I do switch between these things depending on how difficult the encounter is that I'm doing. Main link, Seismic, Advanced, Unbound, Trap and Damage, and Deadly. This is, pretty standard. Some people offer Void instead of Deadly, but I think the hit isn't really that big anyway. Over here, Shield Charge, Faster Attacks, and Flame Dash. I normally like to play with Frostbling, but because of where we are right now with Wither application, you sort of want to be using Flame Dash so that you always have a movement skill available to you, even when you're using Withering Step to apply Wither. Defiance Banner's in. Again, this is sort of optional. I tend to use it. And then Temp Chains is actually a late curse. I don't put this in until probably around level 88, 89, or 90. Despair is your primary damage curse, and this is in a really weird setup over here. I'll get to that in a bit. And then I have a Divine Blessing setup with either Malevolence or Haste. So mostly when I map, I run Haste, because I feel like my damage is kind of enough. But you can see that Malevolence is a gigantic damage increase because it not only scales your dot multi, but also gives you skill effect duration, which affects Seismic Trap. So using this is like, it says 67.6, 69% roughly DPS increase, and I mean, that's a lot to be getting. That said, I love Haste when I'm mapping. CWDT Molten Shell is fairly standard, level 1 CWDT, level 10 Vol Molten Shell. And then over here, I have just a gigantic collection of auras. So when I'm mapping, I always go Grace, Determ, and Hoeg. The reason I go Hoeg when I'm mapping is because I don't want to take this mastery, which is how I'm actually poison capping while I boss. When I'm mapping though, I just want to play with Hoeg. And then when you boss, it's actually completely different. So other than Eater of Worlds, Evasion is sort of seen as a dead stat while bossing. So generally I'll run something like Determination, a Purity, which is most fitting for the fight, so like for Exarch, I'd run, Period of Fire. And then I'd run Skitter bots. And this is the sort of bossing single target setup. And then you see that when I switch this over to Malevolence, it's quite a bit more damage, and honestly it helps a lot too because Skitter bots applies shield. So that's sort of the trade-off that you have to make this patch. You could try to get Devouring Diadem, but I don't really believe in its accessibility. Last patch it felt like something like 2% drop rate or maybe 5% drop rate. At any rate, really, really, really hard to get. Finally, my main links are a bit contentious, so it's really weird to see a setup with both faster casting and unleash. The reason I do this is because you don't get a lot of base cast speed off this tree unless you happen to run like a Profane Water or something on your gear. And really, I think Exsanguinate's base cast speed just feels kind of terrible, even though the skill feels really great for clear. So I'm tending to use faster casting, but Unleash I tend to run around late yellows, early red mass, because this is when you start not being able to at all get close to one-shotting a blue pack. If you do get Obliteration early game, you might be able to hold off on Unleash for a little bit longer, use Cruelty here instead or something like that, but that's sort of where we're at. Gear-wise, I think the setup's fairly straightforward. Obliteration is sort of the best in-slot Fizz to Chaos Poison weapon. I can also use Cold Iron Point if I don't care about the clear, and that's what I do in the boss setup. I tend to opt for an evasion-based shield because of the implicit, which is really nice, giving you a movement speed. You can get up to 9 on a different base. But it's also easier to roll high suppression on this, and I think getting suppression cap feels really nice. The specific mod I'm looking for on helmet is Fizz taken as. So Assassin doesn't have the best built-in physical mitigation. This is partly because of the Ascendancy, but partly because the tree, unless you stretch over to Soul of Steel all the way down here, doesn't get a whole lot of armor. So then getting some extra physical damage mitigation through the Corel Veiled mod, and then also from an Eldritch Implicit, can be quite nice. And I do tend to keep both these mods while I'm bossing. For my body, I opt for a Sadist Guard rather than an armor evasion base. Now you can go for an armor evasion base, but it does make running your Divine Blessing and just casting your skills in general much more difficult to do. It also is more difficult to color because you can see that on my main links, I actually don't run any red gems at all. The gloves are sort of a late game offensive slot. I don't really look for any specific affixes on here while I'm mapping, although getting crafted AoE could be nice if you have an open prefix. There's a lot of things to look for on the implicits. Chaos Dot Multi, Trap Throw Speed. A Suppression implicit can change how you gear. There's also a Poison Chance implicit here, which can also change how your setup goes. Maybe you don't annoy Toxic Strikes, go for Inveterate instead on your Annoyant. Really flexible slot, just changes based on what you end up hitting on your gear. Boots are also a pretty flexible slot, not a lot of offensive things to search for here, and it's also nice that you don't need to get a specific ground mod. Although if I was going to use one, it would be Sap Ground, which is what I ran on my last character into Ubers. As far as an amulet, you're looking for things like +1 Fizz, Trap Throw Speed, that's a crafted mod, Min Endurance Charge, Min Frenzies is pretty solid, and also Damage over Time Multi. I sort of estimate that for a 1-day progression to bosses, you kind of get to have one major damage mod and then some other random mods. That's why this is set up in this POV as is. And then on the rings, these are kind of flexible as well. While mapping, you definitely want to run a Min Endurance Charge, but the reason I have this crafted mod is because I want to highlight that this crafted mod exists. And it's really good for Poison Seismic because it says 30% increased damage from a single crafted mod, which is something like 6% more DPS. While in the early game, you probably opt for a heavy belt to help out with the strength requirements. A crystal belt is probably what I run with. I don't need to use a Stygian Vise for stun mitigation in a duel because I'm 1 point away from Unwavering Stance. So I think a crystal belt is really nice and gives you a lot more flexibility in gearing, especially for your Divine Blessing setup. The crafted mod might not be necessary, again, depending on what your ES is, but it's sort of a safety measure just to highlight. The thing that's most obvious to look for here is Trap Throw Speed, just another crafted mod. In terms of mapping flasks, it's pretty standard. No Jade because your base evasion is quite high, but I do look for an evasion suffix, probably on either this or the Quicksilver, and then Granite, Silver, Quick, and Quartz. Finally, for jewels, it should be pretty standard. Dot Multi, Damage over Time, Global Fizz, Poison Damage, Poison Duration, Chance to Poison, Life, Res, Attributes. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to build. And in the early game, you don't have a lot of options anyway. I think though with a 3% jewel, it's possible to actually fit in Defiance Banner without using this while mapping. But I think planning around a 3% reservation jewel in SSF is sort of annoying, and one of the reasons I don't do that. Now, for those of you that want to boss with this build in softcore trade, this is what I'll recommend. First thing, I don't actually know how much damage this is. What I do know is that in my last run of doing Ubers, my tooltip, given these configs, was functionally somewhere around 2 million DPS, and that felt really high already within that setting. 8 mil is gonna feel completely broken, and obviously you want to use the really broken things for Seismic. 2 Ming's Hearts with Catalyst and a Cold Iron Point. That's the only gear swaps I put in. There's so much more offensive power that you can get. The really jank thing that needs to be done though is figuring out how you want to proc Noxious Strike. While you're mapping Exang with Chain and Unleash is totally fine, you'll generally have this at 100%. When you're actually playing single target bossing, you don't want to stand there and just spam cast Exsanguinate, especially since that costs life and you don't have great regen on a Shadow, right? I think all that there is for regen is growth and decay, actually. So what I've opted to do is actually use an Arcanist brand Blazing Salvo Chance to Poison setup. I do need the Chance to Poison unless you get some flat added chaos from somewhere, or I use like the alt quality here for Divergent to get Fire to Chaos, but that's like super troll, and I'm not POBing with any heist gems at all because I don't want to encourage the existence of heist at all. If you actually look at the config for this though, this Arcanist brand lasts 7 seconds, which is pretty solid. So what you'd probably do on bosses is just throw down your 4 Seismics, put an Arcanist brand down, the boss spawns, dual curse it, press Withering Step, and then you walk around for 7 seconds, wait around to do the same thing over and over again. But generally it's a really low activity build that I'm running now. Obviously, this build doesn't actually level as Seismic Trap for a long time. I started playing Spectral Throw, linking it to Volley, and then CTP if you have a third link, getting Frost Link and the Whirling Blaze faster. And these starting nodes on Shadow are really, really strong and can kind of carry you through all the way. At level 12, though, I would tend to opt into Poisonous Concoction and linking that with LMP and Volley. Most importantly, Volley, though. This isn't going to be really good for your flasks, and it'll drain them like crazy. I would still go down and grab Punishing as the next major nodes, but it doesn't really matter. The way I see it, if you play with these links in, you just will have so much damage playing early game Peacock, it doesn't really matter. And the early nodes here are probably grabbing Replenishing, then going over grabbing Fangs, and then getting this Chance to Poison over here, and then you're at Poison Cap. You will need to grab Precision, so you'll need 1 extra chance mute for that, but it's generally a fairly gem-light leveling process. I opt for Hoeg and Blood Rage at 16. I prio Blood Rage, I just don't really want to play without that speed. One thing to note though is that you don't have a movement skill until you do Library unless you're really tryhard and weapon swap faster attacks with like daggers, swords, claws in your offhand. This actually is what I would do. Last run though I did Spectral Throw all the way to Act 6 and I felt like that was a mistake because re-gearing that is just such a pain in the ass. As your tree develops, I'd probably go down here towards Charisma first though. And then this sort of area, this sort of box right here is the core starting tree. At level 24, you'll get 2 really important gems. These are Despair and Plague Bear. These are your 2 major single target gems. They help out a lot. Plague Bear, especially when it's like level 3, 4, 5, starts to actually probably do more single target than your own skills themselves. And Haste is a big aura you want to run if you're able to. So sometimes I'll swap out Herald of Agony in the early game just to run Haste. But as soon as you're able to path all the way up here and grab Eldritch Battery, you should be able to run the mixture of Precision, Hoeg, and Haste all at the same time. Early Lab is really great as well. If you can get Noxious Strike done, if you feel that you can kill a Zaro as early as possible, do that, because this node is really powerful for Peacock. Last thing to know is that I would probably go do Library. This lets you get a bunch of gems that you need. Something like Advanced Trap is pretty important. It also lets you get Shield Charge, which is probably the ideal movement skill once you're playing Peacock, and also the ideal movement skill once you're playing Seismic. It also lets you access gems you can't access before Act 6, and then you really want to be leveling gems as you're doing Chamber of Innocence before you move on from Act 5 to Act 6. And it's important that you get these gems, especially the main active skills though of Exang and Seismic Trap to level. Alternatively, I guess you could level Blade Vortex if you want to play that route, but I probably wouldn't recommend it. It just doesn't feel that good to me. At the start of maps, this is roughly what my tree looks like. There's a couple of things that are a bit weird. So firstly, the strength requirement is quite low because I'm not pathing all the way down here. In softcore, what I would do is just drop Determination early on and put that in when you're later on into things. And then in the early game, the perk is that you get a lot of damage right away. You could also opt for a heavy belt and then using a negate amulet or maybe an amber amulet, but you probably will need intelligence, especially if you have early access to obliteration. Don't take Whispers of Doom. Temporal Chains is getting nerfed next patch. It's still something you definitely want to have when you boss, but in the early game, it's not worth it. It's basically something like 4 nodes for like 35, maybe 30% damage, and it's damage that ramps over time. If your boss kills take long enough that Temp Chain is actually getting full value at the end of map bosses and white maps, you probably have an issue in terms of how you're setting this build up, and there's something else that's going on that's totally wrong. I think generally speaking though, this early tree is pretty nice and pretty flexible, especially with the overcharge here. I mean, this is sort of a crutch, right? You don't need to do this if you have an endurance charge on kill ring and also have blood rage on your main link somehow. I actually don't take this on my current setup, and certain runs will have different RNG to have things play out differently, and then sometimes you really want to get overcharged just to supplement everything that's going on. It kind of rounds out your build quite well. At any rate, I know this isn't a brand new idea, but honestly, this Poison Seismic Assassin I think has been overlooked for quite a while. Even though it has a slightly more awkward setup than the previous setups, I just think it has so much more damage to offer, especially in the early game. If you got any questions in the coming days, I'll try to answer them. If you have any suggestions or things that you think are really bad about the setup, please let me know. I'm really open to that. I just need to try to optimize this as best as possible, just so I don't embarrass myself when Friday does come.